So I'll turn now to reading some poems from my second book, The Hazards. The Hazards came out in 2015. The title of the book is, of course, references the idea of danger and so forth, but is also the name of a place in Tasmania, a beautiful beach with sort of rock jutting down into the ocean. And I'll read the title poem in a moment, but I'll start with a few other poems first. So I'm going to open with the first poem in the book. Why not? Medusa. This is a poem that, of course, we all know who Medusa is, the mythical figure, but there's a lovely kind of linguistic echo in that when I was living in Italy and spending time with some Italian friends, I got stung by a jellyfish, hugely painful, and my friends all pointed to my leg and said Medusa, and that was the moment that I learnt that jellyfish in Italian was Medusa, and somehow that image made perfect sense to me, the image of the tentacles, the image of Medusa and the snakes for hair, this kind of malevolence. And so this is a poem that's in the voice of both the mythical character Medusa, but also a jellyfish. Medusa. I have always loved the translucent life, the concentricities blooming around me in a ripple ring of nerves. If I let my shadow cinch in, whatever the soul is billows out like hollow silk. Needle by needle, I plume into the rays of an underwater moon, climbing pure and poisonous in the drift of marine snow. Nothing hangs quite so empty. See how my mind skates, vain and clear as melting ice. It contracts with a heart's pulse, selfish, selfish. I glide savage, a stinging chandelier, a brain trailing its nettles through the anemone swell and forests of stiff sea fur. Malice swarms through me in a surge. I know that flare, that bitter reason, and I will float and flower in my season. The next poem I'll read from this book is a poem that takes as its subject female factories. And female factories were spaces in Australian colonial history where women, mostly Irish women, but convict women, were sent to work, and they worked in really punitive conditions, making wool, fabricating things, frequently suffered sexual violence from the overseers of these places, frequently gave birth in the factory, and lived really, really difficult lives. And one of the things that's always struck me about these spaces in Australia is that they're very poorly memorialised. So these buildings are often just repurposed. There's one in Sydney that was then a mental asylum and then a hospital, and the sort of historical record of what has happened in these places is relatively unknown. So that's sort of part of the subject of this poem. And the only other thing you need to know, I think, to understand this poem fully is a little bit about myxomatosis, which is an illness that was deliberately imported into Australia to help curtail the wild rabbit population. Rabbits are an introduced pest in Australia. And so I was thinking, as I was writing this poem, of the things we import and the ways that we, I suppose, try to control and vanish certain populations. And the poem's called This Landscape Before Me. This landscape before me is unwritten, though it has lived in violence. First the factory stood, quiet as an asylum. Then the annihilating mallee with its red fists of blossoms, and the mountain ash creeping over it like a stain. I have no proof, but I tell you there were lead-light windows here once, barred. They cast a little striped light on the women. Now in scrub and yellow broom I stand on a history braided and unbraided by stiff Irish wrists. The rope and span and carded wool are unpicked, as are their faces and names. Londonderry, Cork, Galway, Kildare. As I say the words, they are sucked away to a hemisphere in darkness. I will not presume to say what suffering is, or how it was meted out in this place. At what point it breaks a body, I cannot tell. But this morning I saw a young rabbit hunched in brush and shadow. I saw its lesioned face, its legs too thin to scramble, the bloodberry red and pink scab of its eye. It had caught the disease we brought here for it and wanted a quiet place to die. And it was lucky, or as lucky as it would get. There was time and light. The hawks and dogs had not been written yet and were still out of sight. So in my second book, there's a section of animal poems. I've often been interested in animal relations and predations, and the relationship between the animal and human, and the fact that we think that humans are separate from the animal world, but of course we're part of it. And so many of these poems in different ways see the human in the animal and vice versa. So I'll read a poem. Many of the poems in this book are set in Central America. I've spent a little bit of time there, enjoy the bird life there hugely. And so I'll read one of those poems. This poem is called Essay on the Toucan, and it's set in Osa, in the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica. Essay on the Toucan. The old colonel keeps his uniform clean, his kerchief of revolutionary red, crisp militia black, the absurd cartoon beak. Proud, dictatorial, he sits out his days counting in a grubby run-down hole. He is shunting the dead and the living into clean blue-lined ledgers. He is working through the long division of his shotgun jungle republic, with border and junta, breaking the shanty towns, corpses, trade winds into clean fractions, dashing the old maps with new horizons. He claps his bill, maniacal, tallies huts and hacked limbs, the floral-dressed, the modest, severed heads of women, corrals of them cut down like cane behind the green screen of coconut and balsa wood, that leaf-striped territory. He skips ahead, loses place, starts again, swallowing each dusty, isolate street of cola billboards and mango stalls in a vast nihilistic surge, all names, addresses, faces erased. All hail our cannibal Caesar, one bird and nation of the missing in the macheted ferns and quashed nests, the dark tribunal of the trees. So this book, The Hazards, travels across place and time quite a bit. I am a sort of inveterate traveller. I have lived on a couple of continents, and so the book sort of oscillates between the States, Australia, and many other places yet. So I'll read a poem set in the States, and then I'll close with a couple of other poems set elsewhere. So this first poem that I would like to read is called The Atlantic, set in New York, and it's a kind of anti-love poem, which mostly my love poems tend to be. The Atlantic. Bombed on old fashions at 3, at 4, you snore beside me like a bull, cocooned in puritanical grey flannel. I twitch out the early hours to the methodical clip of your heirloom watch, my face buckled to your wrist, a flaw in Burberry glass. Beside the bed, your pea coat and pocket square slump, limp as evidence we will wound each other yet. Old friend, you were right when you said this can't go on. Still, I find your all-American jaw in the dark and thumb its edge. It drags against my palm like a panther's tongue, no balm for the blade. The weekday shaving lotion you slather skulks behind the bathroom mirror, creamy as money. My mind strands on the rocks of your cropped New England vows, your cock of the walk brag about the brood you plan to raise, the faint praise you gave when you said I was a perfect cocktail date, the kind of girl smart enough to just let talk. Now you laud it in a blue blood job that will make you a millionaire by 40, if only I could wait. Yesterday's Times said more body parts washed in at Oak Beach. Long Island Sound's serial killer stalks his hunting grounds while we sleep. Nobody knows who he is or where he lives, but we are safe here from his atrophied love. Last week, a jogger found a pair of hands tumbling in the sand, dumb as tongues. The sweat strangles. I feel your breath at my neck roll to the cold side of the bed. 2 hands. Last summer, we swam so far out in the Atlantic we struck a rip and scissored our legs in the salt as Montauk went a blue darker than ink. Now you pinion my shoulder like an anchor and knead me from deep in your dream. Something will have us in the end. Okay, so this next poem will take us to Europe. No end to images. No end to tissues of tears beside the bed, or to avenues of trees and cathedrals. No end to bee-eaters in the rose apples, or summer on the balcony in Neukölln. No end to the pharmaceutical clouds over Krakow. No end to the hour I stood and shook like a leaf in the shower's privacy. No end to my name, snagged like a burr. No end to the body, which is colossally small, with its pains and plainer longings. No end to grief, never any end to that. No end to the silver train stalled in Budapest where I wept in the empty sleeper. No end to iron shoes along the Danube. To history, the convalescent light that falls on my desk so evenly. No end to the gardens of Europe with their murderous symmetry. No end to picnics on the forest's edge, or piazzas of pure Carrara marble. To cruelty, madness, oblivion, massacres and women's scarves. The hunger of wolves, ripening stone fruit. No end to fear and secret police, and no end to Bach fugues on the turntable, whose ideas resolve so cleanly into a life infinitely more gentle and orderly than our fraught morning fights, or the cries we sent echoing at night down the hollow halls of love. And the final poem I'll read from that book is the title poem, The Hazards, another kind of love poem, this time set in Tasmania in that beautiful landscape that I mentioned. It's in a national park, The Hazards. It's a very sort of rugged landscape, and it has these quite striking ledges of rock that kind of angle into the sea. The Hazards. How calm, how sudden the strait was that day. Humpbacked rocks sloping down into the sea like the end of a long argument. Everything now peaceful again, but tiptoeing. And past the sweep of gravelly beach, huge pink ledges lopped off in the water like bread ends. Here and there a stump, call them islands, reaching at elbow angles, and the slumbering bergs underneath, snub-nosed as marble. At our feet, digger birds with shiv faces cracked limpets solemnly for meat, blacksmithing. And further out, specks of seabirds fishing the whitecaps. Then that awful, calm, clear green all the way to the Antarctic. Everything tasted of the sea was of the sea. You thrashed out first, hard with your varsity calves towards the far granite cheek. The tiger stretch of your body, powerful but ungainly. Your torso turning from side to side like something the ocean was rejecting. And in a wild kick, a leaping up, I saw you as a stranger might see you then, your head straining above the surface like a diligent retriever's, your eyes fixed ahead, as though the future were an island you needed to reach without me. And I knew I would never unlearn love like this, as distance. Your mild Midwestern college cut, dark and unstable on the horizon. Your too white boxer's shoulders, finite and ungiving as you climbed the scrambling side. You who would live if I died, you who were not I. And I felt the shock, the parry of my heart's start and stop. My life, my life.